Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a Climate Change Forum, your chance to ask questions about climate change. We're pleased that you've joined tonight's webinar, which kicks off Maine Impact Week, a virtual celebration of the University of Maine's research and creativity that have global impact and local relevance. To bring broader attention to this celebration, Maine Impact Week organizers invite all of you to post a selfie on social media with the hashtag Maine Impact Week. My name is Beth Staples, and I'm a news writer and editor at UMaine, and I have the distinct pleasure tonight to introduce a panel of experts: Dr. Paul Majewski, Dr. Cindy Eisenhower, Dr. Sean Burkle, Dr. Ivan Fernandez, and Dr. Laura Rickard. They'll talk about climate change, including why it matters and how we respond to it, as well as public policy, extreme weather events, the Maine Climate Council, and the importance of messaging. Each of them will deliver a 5-minute presentation, and after the presentations, we'll turn to questions that you'd like to have answered. We have questions that some of you submitted when you registered, and if you think of a question during tonight's presentations, please enter them into the Zoom webinar Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can tonight. Tonight's first presenter is Dr. Paul Majewski. He's the director of the Climate Change Institute, and he's a distinguished Maine professor. He'll discuss why climate matters. We're in the midst of many serious issues today: climate change, COVID-19, inequality, geopolitical unrest, and a stressed economy. Climate change, both on its own and interacting with these other issues, is an immediate and a long-term threat to our health, wealth, and security. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you to the VPR office for this opportunity, and thank you for all of you out there who've tuned in. Why does climate matter? Beth just told you that it, in fact, has a very prominent role within many of the things that we're concerned about today. Everything from COVID-19 to inequality, geopolitical unrest, et cetera. In fact, because of climate change itself, and also because of its interaction with all of these other important issues, climate change is one of the major security issues in our world for the 21st century. We're experiencing a new climate reality, and humans are the major driver. 195 countries, all of their scientific representatives, their policy representatives, and thousands of peer-reviewed scientific papers demonstrate how, in fact, humans have been responsible for the recent changes that we've had. These recent changes include opening up of a new ocean, the Arctic, the wildfires in the West to a large degree, increased storm activity, and a variety of other things, including climate refugees and related political unrest. Climate change and its consequences needs to be understood at a local scale, not just a global scale. The way it impacts us locally differs from place to place. If we live along the coast of Maine, it impacts us because of storm surges. If we live inland, it impacts us not only because of storms, but also because of changes in temperature. Climate can change suddenly. One of the most dramatic changes that has occurred on an annual basis is the warming of the Eastern Arctic. Between 2007 and 2012, it increased on an annual basis 8 degrees Fahrenheit. It not only opened up a new ocean in the Arctic, at least during the summer, but it also is commensurate, equivalent to the fast changes that have happened in the past. Except this is the first one of the modern era, and it's being triggered by remarkably high levels of greenhouse gases and faster increases of greenhouse gases than have occurred in the last 850,000 years. Climate change causes severe health consequences. It impacts us in terms of our respiratory abilities through particles. It can cause cancers, cardiac disease, neurological diseases, invasive species. It even has an impact on COVID-19 because it makes us less likely to be able to fight COVID-19 because of respiratory disease. Climate change, even as we begin to think about mitigating, adapting to, and finding solutions to climate change, we will also find that there will be more better paying and longer lasting jobs. A classic example would be offshore wind power, which would create jobs that would last far longer than, for example, fracking, which is occurring throughout much of the country. There are already more jobs in the solar industry than there are in the coal industry. We also know absolutely that clean air laws improve human and ecosystem health, but we need to be vigilant about how they are maintained and formulated. We know that water is critically important to us. In fact, we could go as far as to say that water is the new oil. Water is not available everywhere in the world, and it is becoming less available in many places. In a place like Maine, in general, we're in very good shape. Renewable energy and the demand for reduction are essential to the solution of climate change, but it requires strong legislative support for robust laws and taxes that support renewable energy and reduction. And then finally, of the big general things for us to think about, geoengineering solutions are certainly well worth investigating, but they don't replace mitigation and adaptation. They are not a fix that we can depend upon. We have already experienced several effective geoengineering solutions through, for example, not necessarily that we tried, but acid rain, which put sulfur into the atmosphere and cooled the atmosphere for a while. We don't want to lose our forests at the expense of reducing warming. There are better ways to do this. We need to mitigate, adapt, find new solutions, and geoengineering is certainly worth considering, but it's not the only solution. So if I can leave you with 3 words that are extremely important about why climate matters, think about health, wealth, and your security. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Next, we have Dr. Cindy Eisenhower, an associate professor of anthropology and climate change. She's going to talk about cross-cultural analyses of climate risk perception and variable responses in public policy. Cindy's a cultural anthropologist, and she'll highlight how many societies have responded to the dual crises of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic to pair economic recovery and a transition to a low carbon future. Welcome, Cindy.
Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks so much to the VPR's office and to Paul for this invitation to speak tonight. So so Paul points to a number of compound risk factors and threats to our national security, everything from zoonotic diseases and climate change and pollution to human health crises. But I wanted to talk tonight quickly about 3 opportunities that I have identified that, as strange as it might sound, might arise from the COVID crisis as it relates to climate change. So the 3 opportunities that I want to talk about are green recovery packages, a cultural ideological reset, and then finally, a rethinking of production and consumption networks and supply chains. So I'm sure many of you on the call tonight have seen all sorts of commentaries post-COVID about the opportunities for reinvesting in our economic recovery in green ways and in post-carbon reality. So we've seen policy briefs in Nature, we've seen them in Science, we've seen them in the popular media, and almost all of them kind of coalesce around this idea that we can get both economic multipliers and climate impacts through several policies like clean physical infrastructure, building efficiency retrofits, investments in worker education and training and green jobs, natural capital investment, and clean R&D. And the potential for these packages is really significant, considering that just looking at the US and China, COVID response policies in both of those instances are around 14% of GDP, right? So it's a lot of spending and a lot of investment that could potentially take us in a much more green direction. Now, it is true that many countries have announced green investments, but the share of GDP remains fairly small. But there is some good news out there. And so when we're thinking about potential opportunities, we can look to, for example, the EU or to South Korea, which have in their recovery packages included very explicit and deliberate language in those packages on green economy. So for example, 30% of the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund is earmarked for green climate change related spending. The Sustainable Europe Investment Plan has a just transition mechanism that allocates 100 billion euro between 2021 and 2027 for countries that be most affected by the green transition and the transition away from fossil fuels. South Korea has increased investments in wind and solar, and even in those countries that have not so explicitly linked recovery packages to climate change, we do see some green policies. So for example, here in the US, we have an extension of the solar investment tax credit, and in China, we've seen a 50% expansion in their electric vehicle charging network. So we do see some potential opportunities there. There's a lot more work to do, but there is some good news, strangely, coming out of this horrible kind of compound risk that's we're in right now. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the potential for a cultural ideological reset. Now, this is not just conjecture. We're starting to see a really rapid emergence of empirical literature that suggests that because of COVID, a lot of people are rethinking their consumption patterns and their lifestyles. So we've seen, for example, in many surveys of consumers internationally and cross-culturally, and this is something that we're seeing regardless largely of where people are located, an interest in what we would call the caring economy. So intentionally purchasing from businesses that are locally based, that are known to treat their employees well and have some respect for the health of their employees. Also for sustainability. And that was, I think, one of the most surprising things I'd seen is that, we've been talking about smart consumption and sustainability for a long time. And suddenly with COVID, we're seeing a real uptick in participation, but also how people are thinking about what's necessary and what we need. And then finally, I just wanted to say very quickly, and this was related to this cultural ideological reset, is that disruptions in supply chains associated with COVID have really forced a lot of businesses, a lot of economic planners to rethink our production consumption systems and how vulnerable they are. And to think about resilience, not only in terms of supply chain disruptions linked to COVID, but also longer term threats to resilience. So we're seeing a lot of circular economy ideology. We're seeing a lot of focus on reducing waste. Just one example has to do with food losses during COVID. Many of you know we had just a shocking number of food losses because we had these supply chain disruptions, which is forcing a lot of people to come up with new and creative ways to link people at different levels of scale. For example, Maine Cooperative Extension's Farm and Seafood Directory was a great tool we saw here in Maine. But I guess the basic point is we're seeing a new emphasis on the resilience of supply chains, which has, when you think that 23% of global greenhouse emissions are linked to the materials economy, right? The way that we produce and consume products, that has significant opportunity to rethink those supply chains and their resiliency. So I'll leave it there for now. I have some stuff on public polling too that I didn't get to mention, but I can bring that up in the questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Cindy. Next up, we have Dr. Sean Burkle. He's the Maine State climatologist, and he's a research assistant professor with the Climate Change Institute and the School of Earth and Climate Sciences. He'll give an overview of the past century of climate change in Maine, as well as talk about recent extreme weather events, and he'll note important linkages to the Arctic and elsewhere. Sean also will discuss how the changing climate impacts Maine's economy and health, as well as what changes we're likely to see in the future. Welcome, Sean.
Oh, thank you, Beth. and I thank everyone for the opportunity for speaking here tonight. As Beth indicated, I'd like to give you an overview of Maine's climate and discuss the various aspects of climate impacts in Maine, and also a brief discussion on what we might expect in the future. Now, since the early 1900s, and I'll start with the early 1900s because that's when continuous, high-quality vetted data sets began to be accumulated widespread. And certainly in Maine, there's a robust record that goes back over 100 years into the 1800s. But since about 1900, Maine's climate has warmed about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And with that, winters have become shorter, less severe. The warm season has lengthened by 1 to 2 weeks. Likewise, there's been about a 1 to 2 week lengthening of the growing season. And annual precipitation overall has increased during that time. And there have been changes in atmospheric circulation that have increased the likelihood of what we call atmospheric blocking patterns that can lend to extreme events. And some examples are heat waves, even cold waves, heavy precipitation, and some short-term drought, such as what we've been experiencing most recently since this past May. And when we look into the future, our primary means of doing that is through climate models and also using historical data sets as a guide to develop different scenarios of what might happen. From the climate modeling perspective, these dynamical frameworks that can simulate the climate system response to increasing greenhouse gases, we find that for Maine, by about 2050, there could be an additional 2 to 4 degrees of warming and perhaps as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. Now, this of course depends on the future trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the choices that we make today and in the near future will have an important and significant impact decades and 100 years from now. The reality of Maine's warming, I think, became apparent in particular over the last 2 decades. It was in the late 1990s when temperatures increased coincident with patterns that changed across the North Atlantic and Pacific. It's part of the variability of the warming climate. And so in the last 20 years, there's been the 6 warmest years on record in Maine, all occurring since 1998. And it's also important to point out that the winter season is a defining season in Maine. It's also the season that has warmed most. And we've all observed that lakes tend to freeze up later in the year and they ice out earlier in the spring. Significant impacts to the winter season in terms of snowfall and snowpack, winter recreation. And also another feature or another aspect of the warming climate, the warming winter in particular, are midwinter rainfall events. I grew up in Maine, and one thing that stands out in my mind as being really different from when I was young is rainfall in the wintertime was rare 30 years ago, where now it's pretty commonplace, at least in the southern half of Maine, not quite so much in northernmost Maine yet. Also, a very important aspect of the warming climate is the warming Gulf of Maine. The ocean temperatures are increasing as well. And the warming in the Gulf of Maine is associated with larger scale warming elsewhere, including across the North Atlantic. And by some measures, this year was the warmest on a North Atlantic wide average. And there have been several, what we call them now, marine heat waves have developed, in particular in the last 10 years. And in the Gulf of Maine, there's a significant impact to marine ecosystems, fisheries, and some species will be able to thrive in these new conditions. Other species will have to migrate to more suitable waters. And similar things are happening, of course, in terrestrial environments. Sea level has risen almost 8 inches since the early 1980s, as measured from tide gauges. And associated with that, there's increased coastal erosion, which can be expensive and very impactful for coastal communities. And also an increase in the frequency of nuisance flooding, particularly in urban areas. Portland is a good example of where increased flooding from sea level rise, in addition to high tide that happens to occur when there's a storm event. That type of flooding is becoming more common. Other impacts to the economy and to Maine include with extreme precipitation events. In the past 15 to 20 years, it's been documented that there are more events in which during a short period of time, a lot of rain falls. So if we consider a daily accumulation of either rainfall or snow, 2 inches or day or greater rainfall, in some cases, delivery of amounts near that in just 2 or 3 hours. But dealing with the excess runoff during these events can be particularly challenging. And now, in looking into the future, municipalities will have to decide how to allocate money for upgrading infrastructure to deal with some of these impacts. And so in the case of extreme rainfall and more water that is running off the landscape into the drainage systems, we might need larger culverts. And there are many cases across the state where that sort of work is being done. Also, in terms of the agriculture industry, farmers may need to invest in new systems, including irrigation systems that could be costly. This year is highlighting how impactful even a short-term drought can be. We cannot say at this stage how long the drought will last, although we are starting to see some relief now. But the drought began about middle of May, and but it's been extremely impactful for agriculture, and some rivers and streams are going dry. And so being able to cope with unexpected seasons like this would be increasingly important. And also human health implications, vector-borne disease. And in Maine, Lyme disease has become, more and more people are now familiar with Lyme disease. And that began really in earnest in the early 2000s after coincident with warming across the state that has made the survivability of the deer tick, which carries Lyme, more likely with warmer winters and earlier degree day accumulation during summertime. And so I'd like to say that we face significant challenges in the future, and a lot of this may seem overwhelming, but I think there are very positive things happening in Maine right now, and in particular through the efforts of the Maine Climate Council, as well as through citizen groups who are taking the challenges very seriously and moving forward with plans for both adapting and plans for mitigating our impacts. And so I think that Maine is well positioned to meet these challenges and to create opportunities as well. And thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Sean. Next up is Dr. Ivan Fernandez. He's a professor with the School of Forest Resources and the Climate Change Institute, and he's a distinguished Maine professor. Ivan will talk about the Maine Climate Council's ongoing work that focuses on urgent needs for a coordinated framework to address the unfolding climate crisis in Maine and on the planet. This work is timely and highly integrated into the simultaneous urgency for smart investments to help the economy recover from the pandemic, and doing so with an unprecedented attention to social justice and sustainability. Welcome, Ivan.
Thank you, Beth, and thanks to the VPR office for hosting the event, and likewise to Paul for inviting me to be part of the panel this evening. I'm just going to take a few minutes. My charge here really is to talk a bit about the Maine Climate Council, of which I and many have been involved. And I'm not going to repeat what has been so well said by my colleagues here. except to say, because you can't help but emphasize the remarkable times in which we live. 2020 is remarkable on so many levels, and all of us are involved with climate change in a very chronic and dull way in many contexts relative to the work that we do in our science, and as well in the remarkable way that the climate crisis demands because of what we see unfolding all around us. So 2020 is a kind of a good year to be thinking about comprehensive approaches to address these multiple challenges across our social fabric, as well as what we might call the environment, being in climate change. And it's for that reason I'm really honored to be part of working within the Maine Climate Council activities, as many of my colleagues here are as well. In June of 2019, Governor Mills signed into law a bill that established the Maine Climate Council and established a number of relatively aggressive goals or targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And probably everyone fully understands what greenhouse gas emissions are. First and foremost, we hear about CO2, but methane and nitrous oxides and a host of gases, chief among them CO2, that's driving the changing climate. The reductions were to be 45% by 2030, 80% by 2050, and that's of gross anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from the state of Maine, and for the state to be carbon neutral by 2045. And in addition, to establish resiliency, which is the sort of the technical word for building our ability to adapt to the changes in as healthful and sustainable and cost-effective way as possible. So we talk about mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we talk about adaptation, although sometimes those terms are used in different contexts. The Climate Council consists of, over the last year, has been working to achieve the initial target, which is a integrated climate action plan for the state of Maine. We've had a mitigation plan and a preliminary adaptation plan over the last 2 decades. This will be the first integrated comprehensive plan that's to be delivered to the governor and the legislature by December of this year, so just a few short months away. There were 6 working groups that comprised over 230 members, developing strategy recommendations over the past year, encompassing energy, transportation, infrastructure, communities, farms, fisheries, and forests. So it's very comprehensive. And they developed a set of strategies that are available on the Climate Council's website to deliver as draft strategies to the council itself. The council has 39 members. And it's that group that now is working through a vast amount of information in order to come up with the actual climate action plan this December. It's timely in the context that we've got a global pandemic. We've got an economy that's in difficult shape. We've got social unrest. We talked about, Cindy talked about supply chains and some of the realities that have been exposed by COVID. So I think it's actually fortuitous that the state of Maine has now engaged in this comprehensive effort in order to come up with a framework that both prepares us and invests in our future. And at the same time, we can do that in ways that begin to address, hopefully, many of these other concerns. There's a clear emphasis within the council to develop actions that can be implemented now. So in the context of some of these disciplines, shovel-ready types of initiatives that we can establish right off the bat, as well as developing evaluations, research, planning that will continue over time for the overall effort as required. I think we can expect to see elements of an accelerating transition to renewable energy, electrification of our transportation system, investments in weatherization, investments in working lands like farms and forests, and an array of efforts to build resilience in our communities and our economy that will emerge from the Climate Council recommendations, both immediate actions as well as those that will follow. And while we're doing this, there's a clear emphasis to do this with an unprecedented attention to social equity. So the council and the work that the council is doing is important, timely, and intersects with all of these other challenges, crises, and events that we see unfolding in 2020. I'm going to close my comments, not specifically about the council, but about the question of, why should we be hopeful, which speaks to the reason that we should be looking towards being engaged, all of us, in the solutions that lie ahead. A couple of years ago, one of these climate forums with a group of students, they asked that, and we gave them, the usual pep talk about needing to forge ahead and what have you. But I thought a lot about it, and I boiled it down to three things that I feel very strongly about as to why we should be hopeful. And one is that change can happen fast. And I would give examples like the Green Revolution and combustion engines and antibiotics and computers and the internet. And that was until this year. And so I've amended that slide, as you might imagine, to point out that COVID-19 showed us that the whole planet can change with the right directives and the right initiatives in a very short period of time. So we can change quickly. Number two, we know what we need to do. We've improved a lot of our knowledge, and we will continue to do that, but we've known how to address climate change since the original 1990 IPCC report. We don't need to invent a vaccine. I think of the Climate Action Plan for the state of Maine as being our vaccine for climate change. And number three, it's not a net cost. We see time and time again, we hear that that's the inhibition for moving forward. And yet it's really more costly to not act and to not invest in these solutions. We've seen it time and time again for air pollution controls, and the Clean Air Act repeatedly has shown that investments in controls for acid rain and lead and other air pollutants, that they pay back far more than it costs to address them. So I am optimistic in very challenging times, and I'm excited by the work of the council here in Maine to provide us a framework to move forward. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. And next up is Dr. Laura Rickard. She's an associate professor with the Department of Communication and Journalism and the Climate Change Institute. Laura is going to talk about public engagement in climate change. While public engagement can mean many things, it's often characterized by three general approaches: the cognitive, such as knowing facts about climate change; the affective, such as perceiving risk associated with climate change; and behavioral, such as supporting climate change policy. While much attention focuses on the importance of the cognitive and behavioral categories, Laura will suggest how understanding affective reactions to causes and impacts of climate change is likewise critical and can help guide our creation of effective climate change communication messaging. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much, Beth. And excuse my voice is a little bit, I'm losing it today. I have a 3-year-old with a cold, so I'm sorry, everybody out there. So thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's also really inspiring and humbling to talk to you after my colleagues presented, but I'm going to try to weave in some of their thoughts into what I share with you tonight. So, as a social scientist, I'm particularly interested in how we communicate about climate change with non-scientist audiences, and also how such communication may inspire engagement in the issue. And so, as Beth mentioned in the introduction, when we think about public engagement in climate change, there's sort of these 3 different ways we can think about it. As she said, one is cognitive, so we can know facts about climate change. As Ivan briefly mentioned, he said in passing, sort of, many of us know the influence of greenhouse gases and why we have to reduce them. Well, that would be an example of knowing some facts. And it turns out that is a form of public engagement in climate change. And the second is affective, or sort of related to our emotion. So we can perceive certain risks or benefits associated with climate change. We could also look at an image in a newspaper of a polar bear stranded on an ice cap and feel sorry for that polar bear. And that's a form of affective engagement in climate change. And the third is behavioral. So we often think about what steps we can do, what steps whole countries can do, such as what Cindy was talking about. So it can be voting on an individual level or reducing our home energy use. It can be, as Ivan was talking about, as a state, making a plan or getting a council together. So these three types of engagement really work together. One is not necessarily better than the other, but in fact, I really think we need to think about these three as in conversation. So I know the introduction suggested I would be sort of favoring affect, but in thinking about my comments for you tonight, I thought, well, actually, maybe it's that we need all three. And how I'll sort of finish out my comments tonight is to share with you 4 different assumptions. And these may seem like very commonplace assumptions, but what I'm arguing is we need to challenge and really problematize these 4 assumptions if we're going to establish more effective public engagement in climate change. So the first assumption that we often run across is that our most important job as scientists and communicators is to fill a deficit in knowledge about climate change. And the reason we often think that is that we say, okay, well, if only people knew more about why climate change is bad, what effects it's having, then they would take the action that we want them to. And in some cases, this is absolutely true. Knowledge is important, and it certainly can be something that we strive for as communicators, to share information. But what this leaves out is that there are myriad other factors that are just as important, and in many cases much more important, for inspiring engagement on scientific issues, and especially complex, somewhat tricky and emergent scientific issues like climate change. So some of these factors include things like trust. Do we trust science in general, the scientific process? Do we trust scientists, regulators? What sort of emotions come up for us? I mentioned affective responses, but there can be also discrete emotions that come up when we think about climate change, like something like guilt, for example. How do we process information about climate change? Are we engaging in something called selective or biased or motivated reasoning, where we focus in on one aspect of a message because it aligns with our prior beliefs? And in some cases, much to the chagrin of people who, sort of formulated that message, and we're interpreting it in ways that really jive with our previous views. Cultural, religious, or political worldviews become important. Perceptions of risk and benefit. And also the influence of opinion leaders or various social networks, and how people who are important to us think we should behave with respect to climate change. So all of this to say, the first assumption really rests on this fact that when we talk about climate change with public audiences, we need to get away from this sort of outdated, what we might call a hypodermic needle approach. We don't just sort of inject information into audiences. Not that many of us sort of think that way, but we really have to challenge that if we find ourselves assuming that. There are many mediating and moderating roles of these variables that I've brought up, and these indirect effects can have these really small but quite consequential effects on audiences. So the second assumption I'll bring up is that we can identify a concept of a general public. We often talk about the public, and many of us know this, I think, under it all, that we're not a uniform mass. We're all very different in many different ways. And it turns out that ongoing public opinion research by folks like Yale University and George Mason, who have a Climate Change Communication Institute, has suggested that when we think about, for example, the US, we're really subdivided into many various publics, or what they've termed 6 Americas when it comes to views on climate change. And we can use these subgroups to really think about how messages might be different depending on these characteristic beliefs that vary across these different audiences. And that leads me to my third assumption, which is, as long as we convey the facts, the form of the message doesn't matter. So as I just said, we don't have one uniform public, so we can't have one message about what climate change is and why we should care and what we should do. Again, many of us, I'm sure, might be thinking to ourselves, this is commonplace and we all believe this. But in fact, we have over 50 years of social science research to suggest that framing works by emphasizing some aspects of an issue and not others. And these interpretive packages, or sort of storylines that we use to define what a problem is, what the solution is, and who should be responsible for it, are really, really consequential when it comes to communicating about an issue like climate change. But it turns out that frames, so whether we talk about climate change as an economic problem or a public health problem or public health issue, they're only effective if they're relevant to a given audience's prior beliefs, values, or ideologies. So we've got a whole lot of research right now that's looked at the influence of various kinds of frames when we're talking about climate change. And just a couple examples. Many researchers in the last 10 years or so have started to think about how climate change can be represented as temporally or spatially close or far, and what effects that can have on audiences' perceptions of the issue and behavioral intentions. We also have some really interesting research that looks at the issue of scientific consensus. So if we tell people that 95% of scientists agree that climate change is human caused and happening, does that influence how publics act and how they would react to a message? So I'm going to end with my last assumption, assumption 4, and that's this: whether it's with respect to COVID-19, which has been mentioned by many of my colleagues tonight, or climate change, I'm going to argue that public health is not the only sector that needs to be concerned with not doing harm. This may seem like a jump to some of you, but I'm going to argue that when we frame messages in certain ways, we really have to think about unintended consequences and the possibility of doing harm. So something called boomerang effects, or when our messages have the opposite intention as we had expected or wanted, we really have to invest in formative and evaluative research so that we understand, so that we're not producing messaging that unintentionally harms. So we have to choose messages that do the most good for the most amount of people, or that minimize that harm. And one of the ways to do that is to really ask people what they think. This, again, it seems pretty obvious, but I'll just underline that one of the things we can do is engage in communication efforts that allow us to hear from the very people that we're communicating with, rather than making it just a top-down strategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to all the experts for your thought-provoking presentations. We can start to turn to some questions now that were submitted by attendees, and I guess whoever would like to take it, or if more than one person would like to weigh in, let's do that. The first question is, what is the role of research in understanding how ecosystem service theories and practices can help states and local governments to prepare for climate change?
Well, normally I would not start speaking, but it was quiet, so I'll say something about it. I'm not an expert in ecosystem services, although I am a biogeochemist of ecosystems. So the thought that comes to mind is, I mean, it's really important. One of the challenges with developing policy on the environment is what we can monetize and what we can't. And this is sort of the practical end of the answer to your question. And I don't have the knowledge to take it to the theoretical end. But we do deal with that quite often. A lot of our environment, in fact, I brought up the notion that science-informed policy is almost always cost effective. I mean, that's part of what you get. You determine what's not cost effective, and so don't invest there. And then you determine what the right things to do that are cost effective. A lot of that in the environmental world is often having to do with human health and our ability to quantify or monetize mortality and morbidity related to human health, which are always big dollar amounts. And then in addition, we sort of add on the eco effects, where the consequences, benefits, which speaks to ecosystem services, all of the things that, the forest is the forest. So the first thing we're going to think about is lumber coming out of the forest as a product, but the forest is a habitat. It purifies water, it stores carbon, it provides food, it's culturally important. So there's all sorts of ecosystem services. And a lot of those are very challenging to monetize. And so a lot of times, and if I quoted you some benefit cost analyses for some environmental policies, the numbers I would give would be omitting all of those ecosystem services that we don't have the knowledge to monetize. So I think research is really important from two standpoints. One is to understand the services that were being provided by sustainable, intact ecosystems with lots of diversity. And we have a lot of knowledge in that area, but we certainly need to understand it better. And in a changing climate, those relationships are changing. And so we've never studied the 21st century before. All we know is what we came from. And then the second is there's a real challenge to monetize in order to really have an impact in policy. That's often a direct route to being able to include it in the development of the science-informed policy part. So those are my thoughts on eco-services.
I want to just jump on that really quickly if I could. I think that was a perfect response, but I also think from the human dimensions perspective of ecosystem services, it's also very important that we look at where those benefits are accruing, and to make sure that, as we're implementing, nature-based policy or payment for ecosystem services, that we're doing it in ways that are equitable and responsive to social justice concerns. Unfortunately, the anthropological literature is pretty full of PES, payment for ecosystem services programs that ended up having some pretty devastating unintended consequences for certain segments of the population. So I think that's also important for our research as well.
Excellent, thank you. The next question submitted is, what is missing now in order to enable climate action? And in a perfect world with no political setbacks, what would that look like to you?
Mine will be quick, and then someone else can speak. Put a price on carbon. We've known that for a long time as far as driving policy towards the kinds of solutions we're looking at. Put a price on carbon.
And I would add to that, we need good legislative policy. We know that things like the Clean Air Act worked. The only problem is we don't have enough Clean Air Acts for all of the things that we are polluting, and we haven't kept up with them, or we've removed some of them. And by keeping up with them, we obviously are an increasing population. As a consequence, we need to constantly adjust the legislative policies. We also need good tax laws that benefit renewable energy, particularly for a place like Maine, which is so resource rich. Between our forests that take up carbon, between our wind and water, both of which are renewable, they could advance significantly faster if we had good tax programs that supported these, the way some of our other energy sources, such as oil and coal, have been supported.
I'll just really quickly add that, I hear the question that you can take out all of the political blockades, but I do think when you look at the history of social change, particularly social change that's been lasting, it's almost always a combination of public pressure and then institutionalization, basically through policy responses that become institutionalized. And so I think, what needs to change, we've got a lot of pressure to create climate lovers, but I think that's, one of the best things we can do is just continue to create a lot of public pressure so that we can get some of these changes institutionalized.
And I would also add to that, that one of the most important things we need to do is to improve the predictions for future climate. And we're doing a great job. We have great climate models, we have great analogs, but there are surprises ahead of us. We have already experienced surprises in the last few decades: acid rain, the impacts of the ozone hole, and along with those surprises came many other surprises. We need to be smart about what might cause the next abrupt climate change, which potentially could be the release of methane from the Arctic as the Arctic begins to warm. We need to be smart about how, in fact, we utilize the plausible scenarios that actually exist out there, and that we don't just think that there is one plausible scenario, but in fact there is a range of plausible scenarios, and we need to be prepared for as many of those as we can. That creates a win-win situation. If there are 5 possibilities for the future, we want to be prepared for as many as we can.
Excellent, thank you. How should the average Mainer prepare for the impacts of climate change in the next 10, 30, and 50 years?
I'll jump in. There are tons of things for us to do. It's quite remarkable to see the rapid emergence of small groups around the state that are beginning to do small things that have very big effects. One group I know of in particular that's creating, they're building frames out of wood, very lightweight wood with plastic on them to help people insulate their homes so that in the winter they can dramatically reduce their costs. Mainers pay a lot of money for their energy right now. And if we can reduce that energy by 10, 20%, it's very significant. We can, as a consequence of COVID-19, we're already realizing that we don't need to travel as much as we did before. We're not all in the same place right now, although I'm floating all over the place on this image here. We don't need to travel quite as much, and we need to be careful about the things that we engage ourselves. We clearly understand now, as a consequence of COVID-19, that we can live with less. And living with less and more renewable things is a large part of the solution.
Yeah, the thought I had in answer to that question, it would be what we can do. Number one, obviously it's the season to say this, but vote. We have the most impact on our future climate and our ability to respond based on the policies that we have. And the more we are aligned in the direction of solutions, the more rapid that this transition is going to take place. The second is, depending on what people are doing, from their own livelihoods to their professions, what have you, is to reach out and be sure that you've looked for available information that can help in decision making. There's a lot more in store and ahead, but there's a lot of decision support kinds of information that allows us to use climate data and other data and information to make decisions in light of what we know is changing relative to climate. So, and some of the scenario planning that Paul has mentioned. And Sean here has a tool, the Climate Reanalyzer, that does a great job translating a world of publicly available but very complex climatological data to pretty quick answers and maps and information that you can use. And we see this in different sectors: human health, agriculture, forestry, for different targets. But there's a lot of that information out there. It's the kind of thing that people might identify with. We've predicted floods based on different monitoring, and we've predicted fire hazard based on measurements of dryness in the forest. Those take data and transform them into usable tools and predictions that we make decisions by. There's a lot of that related to climate change, from sea level rise in the coasts to kinds of weather events that we're challenged to do. And then, of course, what everyone's mentioned, what we do, our personal decisions, We now know that right now to excess, of course, but we can Zoom a lot of places that we don't need to get in a vehicle or a jet to get to, and it's having a profound effect. There's a lot of things we do in our everyday life. Right now in Maine, we all should be thinking a little bit about how we use water. And so it makes us mindful of that as we're in a statewide drought. So it ranges across that spectrum.
And I just add too that something really, really simple that anyone can do is to talk to your neighbors about climate change. This might sound very, very basic, but in fact, the more that it becomes a topic that isn't taboo, or we can move away from, we're never going to move away from its politicization in this country, unfortunately, probably, or at least that's an element of it in this country. But the more that it becomes normal to discuss aspects of it, that normative information can be really energizing and can really promote, the behaviors that we need.
Excellent. Laura, let's stick with you for this question that just came in. What do you think is the most effective way to engage with folks who may not believe in climate science?
Yeah, so one way to answer this, and maybe not what this person who asked it was looking for, is to say that you aren't going to reach everybody. And so the good news is, and I know Cindy might be talking a little bit more about this later, and if she gets a question about polling, but the good news is that we see from polling data that fewer and fewer people in this country are in that group of sort of not believing or being, sort of very opposed to the idea of anthropogenic climate change. So one way to answer that question is to say, we're not going to reach everyone. So you sort of focus in on who you think could be changeable, or who you think, you could target. Another way is there are some pretty interesting approaches that some experimental, so some social scientists have done some experiments to look at. For example, using something called inoculation, which, like it sounds, when you give people a shot to inoculate them against getting a future disease, you can sort of inoculate people with beliefs. And so some of this work has been emerging with using inoculation about consensus information about climate change. So if you tell people ahead of time, hey, 95% of scientists agree that this is happening, that in turn can have some interesting positive effects on people's beliefs in the science. However, much of that research shows that the results are often politicized, so they're along ideological lines, so maybe not as effective if you have somebody who's strongly partisan. So that would just be one example.
If I could jump in, I find an effective approach is to ask questions, and in particular try to find out what about climate science does the individual not agree with or not believe. And I found that oftentimes it comes down to this belief or perception that there are cycles, and the present warming is just part of a cycle. We hear about ice ages that happened in the past, and well, maybe an ice age will come again. But then to try to describe or to explain that the scientific community has examined these past changes in climate. We've examined the ice age and why it happened, what are the physical mechanisms, and how the climate system responds to a variety of factors, including changing greenhouse gases, solar variability. Solar variability does have an impact on climate. I like to point that out. It tends to be very, very small. Volcanic eruptions. Major volcanic eruptions have a temporary short-term impact on climate. And then there are feedbacks within the system. Very complex, but we can boil it down to try to give the individual more confidence that scientists have thought of these many different things, and that there are physically based explanations for how they work. And also relating the historical record and showing the data. How has the climate changed in the past century and a half, and how has it changed in Maine? And what is the historical record? For example, one one example I like to use is in the early 1900s, there were several winters in which Penobscot Bay froze over. When I first found that out, I thought that was just really fascinating. Last major event of that sort was 1934. But you can see how the climate has warmed overall in the record. You can see the variability, and we can explain it. We can explain the intervals. These few years, these follow a major eruption. With climate models, we can test how the climate system responds to solar variability, volcanic eruptions, and increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. And what we find is that the natural variability, it still operates, but it may be operating differently now because the climate boundary conditions are changing. But the warming caused by human activity has really emerged from the noise of natural variability since about the 1960s or so, and it's become unambiguous. And so I think to try to collect information, find out what about the science does a person think that is not right or has not been looked at thoroughly, and also I guess really listen to them and don't discount them as just trying to ignore the science. And because oftentimes the person may just want to see the data, and when they see the data and hear an explanation in person, not say on TV or something, they might actually change their perspective, or at least be more willing to think about it more, and then maybe be more accepting.
Thank you very much. Another question that just came in. Ivan, what have been the biggest roadblocks to the work of the Maine Climate Council?
This is just me speaking, but I would say time. So there was a short time to get from the starting gate last year in September, essentially a year ago now, was the first time the council was appointed and convening. And since then, you've had this mobilization of 6 working groups and 250 plus people all told, coming together for a broad array of assessments and strategy recommendations. The challenge of getting every place that you want to go in that process, some of it just takes more time. We can move quickly, but we can't move that quickly. And so that's been a challenge to, you kind of see where you want to go, where you need to go. But it takes more time than you have to get there. And some of that will take longer than the initial climate action plan. The second one, of course, is funding. We're having economic downturn. We've got lots of issues on the finance side, and there's lots of things we'd like to invest in. I think that will be a challenge, and yet we also spend a lot of money on things that we probably don't want to spend money on anymore, like how many millions of dollars we spend out of state on fossil fuels every year. And we have resources that we're spending doing what we do in Maine in state government and beyond, that we can begin to do them differently, again informed by science to address some of these concerns. So it's a little bit of reprogramming resources, redirecting some of the resources, and then hopefully being able to raise additional resources. So time and money, nothing unique, but that's the reality.
Excellent. Thank you. Paul, let's go to you for a question. Is Maine a good place to live as the climate changes?
I was hoping you would ask that question. The answer is that climate change in general, obviously there will be people around the world who will be negatively impacted. There is no doubt that Maine will change. Everything from our trees to the availability of marine life, it'll change. But the bottom line is that Maine's probably one of the best places to live because in fact we do have significant water. It doesn't mean that we won't have dry years like this year. We have immense natural resources. We have, of course, experienced more ticks as a consequence, but at the same time, we're a relatively small population. We can speak to each other. People in Maine care about about nature. They care about each other. They help each other. And as a consequence of where we are geographically, we are not as impacted by some of the really big things. Is it possible that we could ever have a forest fire? Yes, there was one in Bar Harbor. Is it possible that we could have several years of drought? It's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely. And as you begin to compare our situation to many other states and many other countries, more importantly, this is in fact a wonderful place to live. So we're very fortunate. But along with that comes a lot of responsibility. We need to maintain the resources that we have. We have to interact and educate ourselves and prepare ourselves for the future. And you can think about the world perhaps in two ways. People who believe that this is an important problem and people who don't. The people who believe that it is will prepare themselves for the future. And as a consequence, there will be more advantages for them and potentially more jobs. The people who don't believe that this is an issue are assuming that things never change. And that's just not the way the world works. We know that the world could change very quickly. COVID was a classic example. So we always have to be preparing ourselves for some kind of change. We can't put our heads in the sand and assume that it won't change. So the net result is we have the right people, we have the right location, we have the right resources, and we have a state that is really planning very seriously about where we are today and where we'll be in the future and what sort of laws we should have and tax regulations in order to support our future.
Thank you, Paul. Cindy, you mentioned that as a whole, the US is a bit of an outlier when it comes to climate perspectives and action. Can you talk a bit more about why you think that is and whether you've seen these patterns changing recently?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. Yeah, I guess this can just continue on my trend of optimism. So until fairly recently, international public policy polling suggested that the US was, the US along with a few other countries was a pretty significant outlier. Reporting concern about climate change as being a major threat at a much lower level than the global average. Right around 60% compared to a global average that's closer to 70. But the upside of that is that we're starting to see a pretty significant change. So Paul just said things can seem to change quickly. And just in the past couple of years, so for example, since 2013, one of the previous international polls, we've seen the number of people in the US ranking climate change as a major threat going up 19 points. So now more than 6 in 10 see it as a major threat. And if you add people that see it as a threat but not major, we're up closer to 80%. So things are changing, and I think we're seeing a little bit less definition in the party sorting lines, right? We still do see a significant gap between people who identify with Democrats versus those who identify with Republicans, but we even see that slightly softening. So I do think that there are some reasons to be a bit hopeful going forward. But I will say one thing, when I was looking at the recent polling, we do see a really interesting pattern between public perceptions of climate change and the willingness to adopt some of these green recovery measures. So for example, some of the countries that are most concerned about climate change, like South Korea and some of the EU countries, are the ones that are really adopting these policies. So, if this is something that's important to you, it's certainly important also to speak up so that our policymakers know that this is something we're concerned about.
I might jump in for 1 second. As you go backward in time over the last few decades, the US has been a leader in clean air legislation, signed the Montreal Protocol, a variety of other things. So we have the potential interest to do this. And we have been leaders in many things in the past. Right now we're not a leader, but we've done it before, and we have the potential and apparently the emerging interest to do it again.
Thank you, both of you. This question just came in. Are there any initiatives by the University of Maine and the state of Maine to use this expertise to inform and further develop curricula for K through 12 students in Maine.
I can take part of that. I think that there are lots of initiatives, certainly, and they come from a lot of different areas within the Institute. I was fortunate a few years ago to work with a really talented graduate student who developed an entire outreach program around Climate Simulator, the World Climate Simulator, and went into high schools and middle schools all throughout the state to work with students in simulating what future climate change would look like under different types of decision scenarios at the simulating the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, role-playing nations, and making commitments to see where that would get us in terms of mitigation potential and avoiding that 1.5 degree or 2 degree threshold that the Paris Agreement sets up. So we have initiatives like that. In terms of a more comprehensive curriculum contribution, I'm not as certain about that. I don't know if Paul or Ivan maybe have more information.
I'd just like to jump in for 1 second and ask Sean to talk about Climate Reanalyzer. It's a remarkable tool. We get 2,000 to 3,000 hits a day from all over the world, and it's one of the best educational tools. Sean, if you could tell us about it.
Sure, and I was going to mention that because I've had discussions with colleagues before in terms of how to utilize that framework and maybe develop educational modules. And so to reiterate what Paul was saying, Climate Reanalyzer is a web-based framework that provides access to climate models and also weather forecasts, so climate and weather data. And it's in such a way that it can be used by researchers, school groups, and also pages for the general public. And so I do think that there's good potential in using this in a way that could be deployed into the classroom, say with learning modules that teachers could then just work from with their students. Currently the site, I know of a number of teachers who use it in their classrooms, but we don't have any set modules, say, for example, a module on introduction to climate, how to use Climate Reanalyzer to show changes in temperature, precipitation, and so on. But I think it could be very, it's very doable, and I think it'd be extremely valuable to perhaps deploy that right here in Maine and maybe work with 2 or 3 local school teachers and get their input. And so I think that's something like that can definitely materialize in the near future.
And we also have a Climate Futures Framework, which is not necessarily for K through 12, but it's for people in local government to assess what's going on in the climate in their area and make better projections for the future. All part of Climate Reanalyzer. Sean's very humble.
And one thing we haven't mentioned too is that there is a lot of, actually a ton of citizen science work done in the state of Maine. I can say just one project because I've been involved with it. We've been measuring storm surge in 3 estuaries, and I work with a civil engineer, civil and environmental engineer, Kim Huguenard, but we've involved a couple of classrooms on MDI, but also just citizens around the state. And so that's another way. It's both formal and informal education about climate change, and in this case, by actually measuring storm surge in these estuaries that can be associated with climate change.
Perfect, thank you. Sean, you talked about the Arctic sea ice shrinking. What does that mean for Maine?
Well, there are a number of connections to the Arctic in terms of atmospheric circulation and impacts that we're feeling here in Maine. The Arctic sea ice extent is a reflection of how cold the Arctic and how well warm air masses are getting to the high latitudes. And changes in the Arctic impact the whole Northern Hemisphere. And so one example is if we take a close look at the Maine historical record, say the seasonal temperature trends, the fall season really stands out in that over the past 20 years, there's been a dramatic warming of fall season. And I mention this because this coincides with a decline of Arctic sea ice. And the sea ice attains its minimum extent typically in the first or second week of September. This year is now the second lowest extent on the satellite observation record. And as a consequence, with much less ice covering the basin, there's less than half as much ice area over the basin now than there would have been at the end of the melt season 30 years ago. It takes longer for cold air masses to form and spread across the Arctic, and which then is connected to, it's coupled to the circulation of the jet stream and ultimately weather in the middle latitudes. And so the warming falls in Maine appear to, they correlate with the warming Arctic, reduced sea ice, and the delayed onset of winter is the key point. And there are other aspects of this as well. There's correlation between precipitation increases in recent summers in the past decade and a half and patterns that develop over the Greenland ice sheet and extending into the Arctic. And so the warming Arctic has an impact on the middle latitudes where people live and the conditions across the Northern Hemisphere.
Excellent. Thank you, Sean. We're getting to about 7:15. Do any of the panelists have any summary thoughts or closing thoughts for this evening?
I'll just provide the mantra that I had before. Climate change impacts your health, your wealth, and your security. And that's what we've been talking about this evening in many different ways. And if you sit down and begin to take those pieces apart, health, wealth, and security, you'll find out that it's tied up with everything that we do. For people starting their careers, all of their careers will be related to what happens to the climate. And these things are already happening, and they can actually happen faster than we think.
Yeah, I would just add that, well, it sounds a little bit corny to say, I really do think we're in a pivotal year relative to how we move forward. And I think we'll look back and think of this year or these 2 years because of the pandemic, because of climate change, maybe because of elections, as a time that we switched gears and to some extent stopped trying to get back to normal, quote unquote, because there is no normal of the past, but really engaged in sort of for the planet and for humans on the planet, a much more sustainable and healthful future. It's going to be a lot of change. And so the closing thought is to embrace it and be open to it and learn as much as possible about how to maneuver through it and get involved. So thanks.
Everybody else all set? Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for this wonderful evening. Thank you to all involved with setting up this webinar, including the UMaine VPR. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing their expertise. Thank you for everyone attending who sent in those incredible questions. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. I know I sure did. Wishing everybody a healthy fall and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.